I'm joined today by Ashley Jackson, Dr. Ashley Jackson, recovering PhD student, co-director of the Centre for the Study of Armed Groups at the Overseas Development Institute. Ashley, thank you very much for joining us today. Ashley has conducted a lot of research, written a lot about Afghanistan and the Taliban, and we're going to talk mainly about that research today, although I think you've got quite a broad background of research with non-state armed groups. We'll talk about the book in a little bit, which has just come out and is very, very timely. Actually, maybe before we do that, you might just give us a little bit of a brief bio, a bit of background about yourself, and then we can get into what the book's about.
Sure. So I'm not only a recovering PhD student, I'm also a recovering aid worker. That's where I started my career, working for the Red Cross, and I'm working for Oxfam and the UN in Afghanistan. So I went there for the first time in 2009. And this was really right before President Obama ordered a military surge. It was still, unthinkable that the Taliban could make a proper comeback. Obviously, here we are, and they have. But in those years, I switched from doing aid work to doing more research and looking at humanitarian negotiations with armed groups, not only the Taliban, but also Al-Shabaab, groups in Syria when that conflict started, in Sudan and elsewhere, trying to understand, how do you talk to these armed groups in order to deliver assistance, to try and get them to observe international humanitarian law, to give you access to people and areas that need your help. And then, of course, I did a PhD, which is why we're here today, because that is what led to the book. So I moved back to Afghanistan in 2017 and ended up really looking at life under Taliban control, which then, of course, not only led to the book, but led to me being an advisor to the US Ambassador Khalilzad, who was in charge of Afghan reconciliation, into a number of roles trying to advise on and better understand the conflict, the peace process, such as it was, or maybe it'll continue again, and all of those things. So that's my background.
I mean, it's a perfect background for the topic that you were taking on in your book. Maybe you want to kind of give us the broad strokes of the book and the research and what you went, how you went about it, because I think we're always with this kind of research. One of the things that's interesting is how you get access and why you choose to try and access some of the people that you did. So it'd be great to hear about that too, I guess.
Yeah, the book really, it opens with this one story of a village elder who negotiates with the Taliban, but the book itself is really about that, about how people living under Taliban control have survived, have navigated the Taliban's comeback, have figured out how to deal with life under their control. And it's also about the Taliban side of the story as well. When they reemerged in 2006, they sort of started regrouping before then, but really they start to become a force to be reckoned with in 2006. They spread through the south and the east. They start to establish a stable presence in certain areas, but they get knocked back. They get knocked back until 2014. There's a huge drop in the number of international forces present. And then the Taliban begins to move into huge swathes of the countryside, and they sort of take over through this strategy of creeping control. Of course, there's a lot of overt violence, IEDs, suicide attacks, targeted assassinations that paved the way for their resurgence. But what nobody was really writing about and nobody was really covering when I went back to Afghanistan in 2017 was this strategy that the Taliban had to sort of, again, creep through the countryside, set up this shadow government, and really begin to build this government in waiting, really begin to control people's lives. And it was such a strange phenomenon to go back to Afghanistan in 2017 and start to work on this. Because most of the world had forgotten about Afghanistan at that point. There was the Syrian conflict, there was Iraq, there was the Islamic State, there were all these things happening, and not a lot of attention to Afghanistan. You didn't have a lot of foreign correspondence, and you just had a diplomatic presence, cloistered, really fortified in Kabul, with diplomats and most international, though not all, but most international aid workers unable to really get out and about and see what was happening beyond the Kabul bubble, such as it was. I think it's useful to think of Kabul in this capital city as kind of removed from the rest of the country. So what I did was essentially try to go to areas under Taliban control. And I worked a lot with Afghan journalists because they were the ones writing about these things and who lived in these places and were willing to help me get access to work with me, to figure out, who to talk to, how to do it safely, as you point out. But at this point, also, the Taliban is looking for recognition. They've taken over huge chunks of the country without much notice from the international media, and they're effectively setting up the state that they want to show off. So when a foreigner like myself comes into that equation, of course there are risks, and there's also the risk of being co-opted into those narratives. But there was a willingness, both by Taliban themselves, who wanted to tell their stories, who wanted someone to sort of bear witness to their side of the conflict, as well as Afghans living in these areas. I think it's really useful to think about, maybe this is true in any civil war, but to think about two Afghanistans, right? There's the one that we normally hear about in the international media, and that narrative is very binary. They're good guys, the US and the government we helped stand up and allies, and they're bad guys. That's the Taliban and Al Qaeda and others. And the Taliban fell, and this democratically elected government was set up, and everyone had human rights, there was education, all these kinds of things. And undoubtedly, there have been enormous gains, particularly for urban populations, for women living in urban areas, for men, of course, as well, private industry, Kabul, this kind of bubble, but also the major sort of regional cities like Mazar and Herat and Kandahar benefited enormously. They're bustling, right? Or they were. And I think that's one side of the story, and that's very important to hold on to, but that dominates the headlines when we talk about holding on to women's gains in particular, holding on to this idea of democracy. I mean, all of these things are in reality kind of already eroding, if not long gone, in the case of democracy. The last few elections have been absolutely fraudulent, marred by incredibly low turnout, disputed outcomes, politically mediated settlements. The state didn't collapse in August and September. It collapsed really in slow motion over a number of years. So that's that one Afghanistan. But the other Afghanistan, the sort of one that I really focused on in the book and in my work for the book, was the people who had suffered from the international intervention. The US and others partnered with a lot of warlords, a lot of criminals, a lot of human rights abusers, and we called them the good guys. They were now our friends and allies in this new post-Taliban government, and they hunted down not only their adversaries, but innocent civilians. You had US and Afghan government airstrikes and night raids, which terrorized these communities. There are places that I went in 2017, 2018, when airstrikes were at eye-wateringly high levels that looked like, places I'd been to in Syria at the height of the conflict, or at one of the heights of the conflict early on. The devastation is hard to overstate. The number of people who had lost friends and relatives, who had suffered. People would talk about multiple wars that they had been through since 2001, because that's what it felt like. The Taliban would come, the international forces and Afghan forces would come and pursue effectively a scorched earth strategy and call it hearts and minds. And then the Taliban would go into hiding, and then they would come back, and it would go on repeat. And that is the experience that they had to navigate, being squeezed by both sides. And so that is really what the book talks about.
And in your book, there's, you talk a lot about bargaining and trying to kind of make these accommodations with the Taliban or whoever else, just trying to work out how to live day by day. And the access or the discussions that you have striking that I think it's, you get some really honest, interesting perspectives from Taliban, from civilians. Um, was it, as an outsider in this particular situation, coming from the US, was it difficult for you to get people to open up or for them to trust you, or did you find that actually people were interested in talking to you and telling you about this reality? How did that come across for you?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about how it must have been to be on the other end of these interactions, to be the people I was interviewing, I'm sure it was a little bit strange. Everything I did was through networking, just trying to find someone who knew someone who could introduce me and bestow a level of trust so that there would already be a basis there to speak a little bit more openly about issues that are impossible to talk about with a stranger. Um, Even then, there were lots of encounters that were really an education for me, in terms of my own preconceived notions. You walk in a room and you have all these questions you want to ask about things, but that's not really the story someone necessarily wants to tell you. And so I think the process of doing research for this book was relearning. Every time I do research, I relearn this lesson. It's how to create space so that people can tell you what they really need to tell you, so that they can educate you about what it's really like. And so, the first few months of interviews were stumbling through that and having these encounters where people would very kindly, probably more kindly than I deserved, correct me and correct my misapprehensions about the way things really worked. I had worked on Afghanistan for almost a decade at this point, and yet I had so much to learn. And I think, part of the issue with the way we talk about civilians is how passive they are. And when they have agency, it's agency that we give them for like a specific purpose. And we use terms like support or, yeah, support's a big one, right? And we talk about winning their hearts and minds, and we talk about the people as the prize. I mean, this is all counterinsurgency language, but you find similar stuff in stabilization and elsewhere. There are also narratives around saving people, right? Especially in Afghanistan, and victimization. And the truth is so much messier and contradictory. I mean, once you sit there with someone and they sort of tell you the stories of what it's like, you kind of have to have a dark sense of humor, as people often just have to as a last resort, because of the paradoxes, because of the weird bargains that you strike. And it is bargaining. In all of these conversations, I tried to find a framework that would best describe what people told me. You do hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and then you're sitting with it thinking, well, how do I make this add up to something academic and whatever? But, and people themselves used very different ways of describing things. One person talked about dancing with whoever was there. I don't have a choice here. I have to dance with whoever is there. I danced with Karzai, I danced with Mujahideen, and now I'm dancing with the Taliban. And I actually stole that and made that a chapter title, because that kind of language describes the messiness and the contradictions. But there was also this one really memorable encounter I had, which I talk about in the book, but where I've done this interview with someone and he's being very diplomatic with me about what it's like to negotiate with the Taliban. The Taliban have taken over his local school, he's a teacher, and he basically has to work with them. He surely doesn't like this situation. He surely doesn't endorse it. Let's say he doesn't seem to me to support the Taliban, but he's unwilling to criticize them. And so at the end of the interview, I'm trying to get him to talk about the way he actually feels about the situation, where he is in this. And with a friend who was sort of acting as my translator, and I keep asking, ask him who does he support? Does he like the government? Does he feel like the Taliban should take over? Tell me about this. And I keep finding different words, and then he's translating like, no, that's not the right word in Dari. That's not, no, you have to use a different word. What other words can we use? And we keep going back and forth about this. And my friend who's translating says, okay, look, you can't ask him this. You can't ask him who he supports. That's a completely invalid question. He doesn't have the choice. He literally doesn't have a choice of who to support. So why would you even ask that question? And the way you said it made me immediately realize that what I was doing was incredibly insulting and unfair and just awkward. And that is why this guy was basically not non-answering me, because I clearly didn't get it until, of course, my friends knocked some sense into me. And then once he did, we talked with the guy about what I had just been schooled in. And the guy was like, yeah, that's it. That's it. Now we can have an honest discussion about how incredibly screwed up this situation is and how complicated it is for me. But now that we've gotten that out of the way, you can stop asking about my hopes and dreams and what I would like to support, because that's obviously not an option in this equation. So, I think that was the beginning of me seeing it kind of differently. It's not, you can never ask someone in a conflict who do they support, or if things are going in the right direction, or all these kinds of things. The stories they have to tell about how they feel and how they experience things are much more complicated, if they can even process that cogently. And I think that's the point, right? That's the real point of what it's like to be a civilian in conflict.
I mean, that's an excellent illustration of the importance, the value of you said, of listening. And you don't even necessarily know what the right questions are, but it's very, very typical for outsiders to go in with ideas and questions or a viewpoint. To what extent has there been a failure generally, perhaps internationally, with those that have become involved in Afghanistan, to understand this kind of the nuance or the realities on the ground? I mean, I assume to quite a big extent, it's usually the case in conflicts. But do you feel like that might have changed something had there been a better understanding of the realities on the ground? Was there a failure to understand things, or is that not really the issue for what was happening?
Yeah, even in like 2009, 10, there was so much energy on supporting a narrative of success in Afghanistan and upholding this myth of this one Afghanistan where the good guys and the bad guys existed and we were the good guys. There's a willful blindness for many, many, many years. That may not have been true in the beginning, but it was a fraud perpetrated against the Afghan people with the complicity of the rest of the world and people like myself, aid workers, UN officials, donors, academics included. And it takes a lot of work to maintain that kind of illusion. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all of us who are working at the UN or we're working in embassies or we're believing in a certain version of events, we're doing so with malintent. But we didn't look hard enough. We didn't look at the country on its own terms in the full scale of its diversity. The idea that someone would prefer the Taliban over a democratically elected, allegedly government over this benevolent international intervention was unthinkable. It was unthinkable. And the idea that the Taliban could make a comeback, even more unthinkable. But when you see how badly people suffered at the hands of this intervention, at the hands of the government that the international community propped up, if you peel apart kind of the layers and the propaganda, it becomes immediately clear why someone would prefer the Taliban if they had a choice, or simply just, consign themselves to realizing that the Taliban would, of course, come back. And this is who we have to work with. This is who is going to govern our lives. And there are pros and cons to that. And there's a way to navigate that. And that is all that matters for the survival of myself and my family. And yeah, I mean, it's just such a hard thing to answer. If we understood the situation, I don't think we would have been there 20 years. I think that's the real sign that there was a deep, deep misunderstanding at the root of the entire intervention, at the premise of the intervention.
I think it comes across, I mean, obviously, more recently, Afghanistan, you said before, had really dropped off, international radar or attention. It was focused on Syria. And then obviously things have come back in a major way. There's talk about this being like the US's Vietnam again, and there's debate, certainly in the UK as well, a lot of debate on different perspectives on should there have been a withdrawal, if there was a withdrawal, could it have been done better? Some, all of these different sides. Again, I detect what you were saying there, that I feel like there isn't much, at least here, I don't see much focus on the notion that a lot of Afghans had really suffered from the intervention. All of the focus is on how they have suffered from the Taliban or will suffer from the Taliban, and how they're being abandoned to this fate. And again, maybe not a full understanding of those things that you mentioned. With all of your experience, with everything that you've heard from speaking to people, and everything you read about now, how do you make sense of what's happening at the moment? And not to get into predictions, that's obviously a very tricky game, but do you get a sense of this being some big mishandled disaster on the side of those who've withdrawn, or is that really not really the point?
Yeah. I don't know where to begin with that one, but I do want to tell you a story based on what you
Please.
started with. So a couple of weeks ago, I get an email from Lindsay Hilsum, who's this legend, foreign correspondent legend in the UK, and she emails me and says, "Oh, the book looks amazing. Come on Channel 4 News. Jon Snow. I mean, I'm yeah, this is amazing. Who gets that offer?" And to sort of talk about the work that I've done in this whirl of my own ego and my own being impressed, but that this person would even want to read my book. I'm excited to do this interview, and I'm logging on, obviously doing it on Zoom, and so I'm watching the segment before, and it's about the 2 adult children of a Royal Marine who was killed in Helmand. And he was killed in an insider attack, which means that an Afghan he was training turned his gun on him and killed him. And then I think the Afghan killed himself. But there's been a spate of these, or had been, when international forces were closely mentoring Afghan forces. And I'm watching this segment unfold, and I'm watching the children of this soldier who died talk about whether or not it was worth it. And the daughter says, we installed a democratically elected government, and girls were going to school in Helmand. There was peace in Helmand. That is worth it. That is worth something. And the son says, no, not worth it. Not worth it. Look at what's happened. This is in the midst of the sort of airport debacle and all these Afghans trying to flee and hanging on to planes as they were taking off. And I'm sitting there having done a lot of research in Helmand, a lot of research. And life for women has not changed very much at all in Helmand. Very few girls go to school in Helmand. Almost no one voted in the last election in Helmand. The airstrikes and the number of people killed in the last few years in Helmand has been catastrophic. The amount that people have suffered, the number of young men who've disappeared from their homes in the middle of the night, not only recently, but certainly while the British were there. And the way that the British partnered with local warlords who for decades had been terrorizing the civilian population and called them allies, really brought the Taliban back. And I'm watching how this unfolds in this family's life. And I mean, like, I just don't even want to be like, how do you speak to that? Luckily I wasn't being asked to speak to that, but I guess I hadn't paid close enough attention to the narratives that were taking hold politically to justify the UK's absolute folly, absolute disaster of an intervention in Afghanistan. And that was one of them. It was worth it because girls could go to school in a place where they did not go to school. And elections could happen in a place where elections have been deeply fraudulent and violent. And so my segment comes on, and it's a former ambassador, someone who I briefed a lot, and it's another former soldier, and they're arguing, well, we could have just stayed. And I'm looking at this ambassador thinking, you couldn't leave your compound without 6 heavily armed guards. You could have stayed. It's outrageous. Like, I briefed you on how the Taliban was, 2 hours from the heavily fortified gates of your compound. How, of course, in live TV, you can't like have a go. But I tried. I sort of said, well, all of this existed while you were both there. You saw the Taliban. No one could have stayed. There was no status quo to uphold. The Taliban was at the gates of Kabul. We know this now. You couldn't have sustained something that fell apart so quickly. And I'm sort of rambling here, but this is just, I guess, my own personal sort of, I don't know how to engage with the narratives that exist in the UK media sometimes, because they just are so completely divorced from the reality of so many Afghans, especially in places where the British troops were present. There's so much been written on Helmand, and it's clear that the people talking about this intervention have no idea what life was like for Helmandis throughout the years, and the kinds of personal tragedies that befell them because of the UK, the US, and other international forces. Certainly as the Afghan forces left Helmand, gross war crimes were committed. This has just been covered in the press, but you had the Afghan Air Force just bombing heavily, densely populated bazaars and villages because they could. And you had the head of the army, effectively Sami Sadat, go on CNN and talk about how Helmand was a beautiful place and how it was peaceful. So this duplicity, this kind of this disjuncture, it's just, at one point there will be a reckoning. I guess that point isn't now. It's hard to believe that there wouldn't be a real rupture in these narratives now after what we've seen, but they hang on. And I guess looking back at Vietnam, I don't really like those parallels because I think it's a very different situation, but it took years and years for the US to really internalize what had gone wrong. And I think the same will be true of Afghanistan.
I should ask, given that we are normally an urban violence research network, I should ask you something about the urban dynamic. And I think that's also been something that has surrounded the idea of this kind of catastrophic, rapid advance of the Taliban, was that, there's a real, actually, now that I think about it, it's a really old colonial idea of the city as the kind of the bastion of civilization, and it's fallen to the countryside, rural insurgents. But there is this notion that this is a rural insurgency that suddenly hit all of the cities, and there's concern about what happens with conflict in cities. We know that it's often, quite severe. How significant actually is this urban-rural divide in Afghanistan, and how significant is it? You said before Kabul should think of it as a bubble. Is there a problem that civilians within Kabul themselves might not fully understand what you said about Helmand, that, actually the girls mainly weren't going to school? Does this urban-rural divide really shape both politics and our perceptions or misunderstandings, perhaps even, of the Taliban?
Absolutely. And I think, God, Afghanistan is so diverse. I don't know if this is accurately portrayed when we talk about Afghanistan, but it is. At one end of the spectrum, you have the Taliban. At the other end, you have Ashraf Ghani, sort of a World Bank economist, super liberal and embodying all these kind of diametrically opposed values to the Taliban. And that is Afghanistan. That is the spectrum. And the cities versus, the rural, deep countryside of Helmand, it's an entirely different mentality. And Afghanistan is both of those things. And I think that's why it makes it really hard to talk about the conflict, because it's a very complicated, messy narrative where these two versions of Afghanistan are at war with one another. And it was so interesting to sort of, well, it was tragic, but it was sort of interesting to see how everyone thought that the cities would hold out, that, the Taliban had been responsible for these sort of summary executions, targeted assassinations in the cities for months, years leading up to, but really intensifying months before this big sweeping offensive that began in May. And we saw them making moves. We saw them setting up Sharia courts on the outskirts of cities to try and get a foothold and balance the violence, to show people, look, we can bring you justice. The police here are completely corrupt. Let us help you. So you saw them making moves in urban areas, but it is a deeply rural insurgency. And so everyone assumed, myself included, I was sort of drafting an editorial at the time as things were happening, saying, oh, they'll never take the cities, they'll surround them, they'll choke them, they'll punish urban populations, because that's what the Taliban does. It views these urban areas as bastions of indecency and immorality. And that's what they did in the 90s. And that's what I've heard in my research. And that's what they'll do now. That is not what they did. They took the cities in some cases without firing even that many shots. They took the cities. How they took Kabul is not entirely clear yet. It seems as though they were trying to negotiate something with the government, and then of course the president fled. We don't really know what happened there, but they took Mazar, they took Kandahar, they took Herat. In some places they negotiated with businessmen to take major provinces, border crossings, urban areas, because people knew which way it was going. And I think when you know that the house built on sand that was this intervention is crumbling, it's time. It's time to allow that, to not fight against the tide, because you will only suffer. And people are exhausted. And I think that's part of what happened. And so, but then when the Taliban took the cities, they didn't really know what to do. So they tried to keep everyone calm. And the Taliban calming people is a really difficult exercise, because I think a lot of people are just inherently terrified of the Taliban, regardless of what they do. So even when they, I have a friend who lives in the northern city of Kunduz, and they were going house to house looking for government employees, and his brother works at the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation. And they came to his house and they said, where is he? And he came forward and he said, okay, just leave my family alone. He's like, no, you have to go back to work, sir. You have to go back to work. And I'm laughing. It's not funny, because rightly this person was terrified, because the Taliban have been going house to house killing people, right, in some areas of the country. But in some instances, they were desperately trying to get people back to work, show a modicum of business as usual, keep things stable, because they don't really know what to do with urban areas. And we've seen this play out in Kabul. There have been all these women protesting, and some Talibs allow them to march. They get one block, and then another group of Taliban are firing in the air and attempting to beat them. You see the Taliban not knowing what to do with the urban mentality of women who would protest outside of the home, of managing the urban environment. It's all incredibly new to them. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to see the Taliban try to govern urban areas differently than they did in the 1990s, at least for now, at least while the world's watching. I mean, we don't know what will ultimately happen. But yeah, it's a really strange dynamic to sort of try and talk about all these things in an integrated way, and to see urban areas which have been really mostly protected from the violence, except for spectacular attacks and these targeted killings, which are absolutely horrific, but it's more sporadic. Urban areas have been stable, and now things have really changed.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see the kind of the public relations exercise going on. It's something that you wrote about during the pandemic as well, with the kind of supposed health response, and how long that lasts and how capable, what capacity the Taliban has. It will be interesting to see, as you said, to deal with the cities. And I'm just wondering how much, people are worried what they're going to do in power, how they're going to change things. And I'm just wondering how much the Taliban might be changed by this, like what this will do to the Taliban, not necessarily having a war to fight anymore and having to govern and having to, it's a very difficult thing, isn't it, to do that. So
yeah,
I guess the hope anyway is that it's not going to be violent and abusive, and that there will be some kind of sustained protection of human rights, I guess.
I mean, it's really kind of strange to talk to friends and people I worked with on the ground, many of whom have tried to leave or have successfully left as well. But what some people fear is the repression. What other people fear is the lack of opportunity, the world turning off the taps of aid and turning its back on Afghanistan. We've seen the international financial institutions cut everything. The World Bank say we're pausing trust funds, we're pausing all aid. That means they're pausing the health budget, which means there's no medicines, there's no salaries for, if that doesn't restart within the next week, 95% of Afghan health clinics, hospitals, and health posts will close. And already they're struggling. And so what a lot of people, I think, fear is the utter collapse of everything that was built. And it won't be the Taliban that dismantles all these gains that everyone's talking about protecting. It will be the international community before the Taliban even has a chance, because they've sort of turned their back on Afghanistan because the Taliban forced things militarily. I'm not sort of letting them off the hook. They should have known this was going to happen. I don't think they did. I also don't think they thought they would be allowed to take the entire country. They were. And here we are in a mess that no one expected. But I think what a lot of people fear is that economic collapse. For some of my friends, or some of the people I've worked with or met in really rural areas of Afghanistan, this is the first time they've been in peace. The airstrikes have stopped. So it's this terribly complicated picture where anything you say, the equal opposite thing, is true about someone else in another area of the country. And that's the story of this particular civil war. That's kind of the nature of it. And then the thing for the Taliban is, how do you, like, winner takes all kinds of arrangements is victor's peace. If they exclude everyone again, they're never gonna have a shot. I mean, you have to reconcile these two Afghanistan somehow. That's how you get to peace. That's how you get to a stable government. And my greatest fear is that the Taliban doesn't understand that, or won't be able to enact that for various reasons.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Whether even if there are those that want to achieve that, whether they're capable, whether they can bring all their members along, and whether it can happen.
Yeah, or the nightmare scenario is if one of the regional powers, Afghanistan has many terrible neighbors, Iran, Pakistan, India, who might start to fund ISK or another splinter faction, or so many things could go wrong that aren't even the Taliban's fault. And on top of that, the Taliban could do a lot of stupid things, incompetent things, cruel things, terrible things. There's just so many ways this could go horribly. It could get worse. I think some people think a Taliban takeover is the worst thing that can happen. Actually, no, there are far more horrific outcomes for Afghan civilians, I think.
I imagine that is the painful lesson that a lot of Afghans have learned from their own history. It must be very difficult to be optimistic, to think even that far ahead about a distant future, the way things have gone. Anyway, it's a sad note to end on, really, but I think it's, you get that last kind of point you were making about, for every one experience, an opposite experience is also true in the country. Definitely, obviously true for Afghanistan, but I think for so much of the world and of the difficult things that we study, that's what we need to keep in mind and try and avoid these really reductive narratives, or just one thing is true and this is the way things are, and you obscure so much of the other experiences, which is difficult, but vitally important to do. So the book is Negotiating Survival. I think that's the title. It's out with Hearst and Oxford University Press in the US, I think. So we'll share a link with that, and I think hopefully you will be able to write a blog piece for us at some point as well, so we can
do that.
We can hear more about it. But Ashley, thank you so much for taking the time out. And I mean, your research is really important, and it's fascinating to hear it. And those little stories, those anecdotes, really quite powerfully convey a lot of what you're trying to say. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much.